So, I'm going to talk about aesthetic experience, and you might think that's just boring. There's been a lot of talk of aesthetic experience. What could I possibly say that's not been done before? But what I would like to do is to draw your attention to an aspect of aesthetic experience, which I think has been a little didn't really get the attention that it deserves. By the way, so I get all these messages of people joining the waiting room, which means that it beeps a little bit. Is that annoying? Well, whether or not it's annoying, that's how it is. So, okay.
Sorry, I'm going to try to fix it, to silence the ringing.
It doesn't disturb me, as long as it doesn't disturb you guys. So yeah. So I'm trying to say something new about. Actually, I'm just going to make this big. About aesthetic experience. So here's the kind of general lie of the land in thinking about aesthetic experience. And so the question is, how should we characterize aesthetic experience? And that's one obvious choice would be to say that, well, we should characterize aesthetic experience in perceptual terms. I mean, it's an experience, right? So if we want to make clear about how aesthetic experience is different from non-aesthetic experience, we should refer to some kind of perceptual feature of it. So one widespread way of doing this is to talk about, what are the properties that we're perceiving. Maybe when we have an aesthetic experience, we perceive different properties, beauty, gracefulness, or something like that, from the kind of properties that we experience when we have a non-aesthetic experience, when we experience properties like, I don't know, being red, being a car. So I'm not gonna talk about this thing. I'm just going to tell you how people have been thinking about aesthetic experience. Another way in which perceptual can somehow characterize the aesthetic experience is in terms of attention. So I myself am trying to do this. I gave two separate, somewhat separate accounts of this. So you might think that what makes aesthetic experience different from non-aesthetic experience is that your attention is exercised differently. So one way of catching this out is to say that your attention is somehow distributed, but at the same time focused, so distributed across properties, but focused on the same object. Or you might think that attention, when you have aesthetic experience, you're not only attending to the object that you see, but you're also attending to your experience itself, and especially the relation between the two. So, you can play around with that, but that's not what I want to do today. I'm not going to somehow defend my own view. That's boring. It's just that's another way in which you can somehow think of aesthetic experience in perceptual terms. A second kind of big group of views about aesthetic experience try to somehow characterize it as evaluative. And one big player here is the kind of valuing for its own sake view. So the idea is that if you have an aesthetic experience, then you kind of value this experience or the object of this experience for its own sake. Again, I'm not going to assess this view, it's just that it's out there. Now, one thing that people have not really been focusing on in terms of characterizing aesthetic experience is what you do, is the action that you perform. And that's exactly what I'm trying to do today. And you might think that that's just silly, because one very often emphasized, kind of going back to the Kantian tradition, emphasized feature of aesthetic experience is that aesthetic experience, what makes aesthetic experience special, is that it's cut off from the practical. So there's less action involved. When we have normal experiences, when we are driving a car, we experience pedestrians, then that's all kind of connected to action. It's all action relevant. Whereas aesthetic experience is what makes it different is that it's not so action relevant. It's really cut off. But what I want to argue is that we should really pay attention to what we do while we have aesthetic experience. That's a really important aspect of aesthetic experience. So, So then this is the question we should ask. What is it that we do when we engage aesthetically? And there's kind of three kinds of answers that you can have. The first one is the simplest one, is to say nothing. You do nothing. Aesthetic experience is something that happens to you. It's kind of a wave that crashes over you, or so it's something that you don't have any control over. It's just something that happens to you, and you're just a passive sufferer, as it were, of the aesthetic experience. So I don't think that's true. But here is a, and I don't think that many people would think that. I mean, sometimes it seems like that's exactly how aesthetic experience works, but that's not kind of a general feature of aesthetic experience. Now, the second option is to say that, well, there's action involved, but it's non-intentional action. So philosophers of action make this distinction between intentional and non-intentional actions. So the intentional action is when I'm trying to do something and I do it. So I'm going to try to touch the camera of my computer and I do it. It was an intentional action. But there's also non-intentional action. So I've been gesticulating like crazy, which is what I do, and also like stepping left and right, because what I did, that's what I do. None of this was intentional. I was not trying to do that. None of that was very premeditated or deliberate. It's just that something we do. And there's a lot of kind of it's a gray area between the two. So blinking, swallowing, are they intentional, non-intentional actions? In any case, to go back to aesthetic experience, it seems like an attractive view that when we have an aesthetic experience, we do perform non-intentional actions. So for example, we move our eyes, right? So we're looking at a painting, then we move our eyes depending on what kind of features there are on the painting. That seems like a non-intentional action. It's an action. It's very much an action, but it's not an intentional action, or at least very often it's not an intentional action. It's not that, all right, now I'm going to look in the bottom left corner of the painting, and then I do it. It's just something that I do, but I'm not doing intentionally. So, but what I'm going to argue is that it's a really important aspect of aesthetic experiences. It's really important to pay attention to what it is, what kind of intentional actions we're performing while we have aesthetic experiences. And what I'm trying to argue is that very often when we have aesthetic experience, we are actually trying to do something. We're performing an effortful action. And in that sense, that's actually going to be a different experience from other kinds of experiences, like the experience of red. When we have an experience of red, if you put something red in front of my eyes, then I'm gonna just have an experience of red. It does not take effort. It's not the case that I have to try to see the red in order to see the red. So there's a big contrast here between aesthetic experience, where there is an effortful action going on, and the experience of like a color experience, like experience of red, where there's no effortful action going on. So that's a kind of a compare and contrasting. So that's a contrast, but here's a comparison that's going to be quite important later on. And that's the analogy with emotional experiences. So very often emotional experiences are also experiences where we are actively trying to do something or effortfully trying to do something. So, and that's in the emotional literature, that's often called emotional regulation. The problem with that is, and that's a nice literature on that within the philosophy of emotion and also psychology of emotion. But the emotion regulation literature mainly focuses on negative emotion. So the idea is that if you have a negative emotion, you're trying hard to somehow have less negative emotion. But what I'm trying to focus on is kind of the opposite of that here. When we have when we're trying to achieve something positive, something that we know is going to be rewarding, an aesthetic experience. But that also happens in the emotional domain. So very often you are trying to, you know that you should have a certain kind of emotional experience, but you're not having it, and you're trying hard to get it. So one example would be, I don't know, you're at a funeral of a person who you really care about, but somehow you're not feeling sad enough, and you're kind of trying to make yourself feeling more sad. And then it's the opposite of that when you're, I don't know, you're at your wedding or something, and you feel that you should be like really over the moon, but I don't know, there's this mosquito bite on your elbow and it's really scratching, and I don't know, your feet are too warm, whatever. So you can't really focus on the happiness. You're trying to somehow make an effort to feel happier, to feel to have more of the emotional experience. So that is called emotion regulation. And I think that something very similar is going on in the case of aesthetic experiences. And I put in parentheses that maybe it's also happening in religious experiences. I don't have first-hand experience of that, but I understand that that is something that religious people report, that they very often, when they actively are trying to have some kind of religious experience. Sometimes they succeed, sometimes they don't. So let me just give you two examples to just drive home what kind of actions I'm talking about that are involved in aesthetic experiences. So the first example is about aesthetic education. So I think that these intentional actions that we perform in these effortful actions of having some kind of aesthetic experience is extremely important for the way we acquire our aesthetic, musical, and so on taste, and especially important in early years and in childhood and especially teenage years. When for some reason or other you think that, well, this is a work of art that I should feel that I'm blown away by, but very often you don't feel that you're blown away by it, and then you try hard to be blown away by it. So so I think that's a really important and kind of neglected way in which musical taste or taste in the domain of art develops in general. There's been a lot of talk in both in the aesthetic domain and psychology in general about the mere exposure effect. So the mere exposure effect is this pretty well documented psychological phenomenon that if you are exposed to a certain stimulus, then that's going to make you like stimulus of that kind more. And there's been nice experiments, including in the aesthetic domain. So James Cutting, who's not really an aesthetician, he's a psychologist at Cornell, but he has this long-standing interest in aesthetics. He did this little experiment when in his lecture on audition or something, he just put in randomly various impressionist paintings between the slides without any explanation. And then at the end of the, so that he did this throughout the semester, and then at the end of the semester, he tested he performed a test on the students about how much they liked each of the paintings, and there was a very clear linear correlation between how often a certain painting was presented and how much the students liked it. So that's supposed to be like a nice demonstration of how mere exposure effect works. Just because you're exposed to a certain stimulus, in this case, a certain impressionist painting, that's going to make you like that painting more. So there's been a lot of discussion about this in aesthetics, and whether that, I mean, Cutting himself wants to say that leads to some form of anti-realist conclusion, so people push back and so on. But what I find, you know, we can talk about it, but what I want to emphasize about this is that most often when we are growing up, our exposure to works of art is not mere exposure. We do know what we want to do with that kind of stimulus. It's not that we have this completely mere exposure. It's just an exposure to something that we have no, we're not doing anything with. Most of the time we encounter works of art, we encounter in a kind of context where we are, when we know what kind of experience we should be having. So either, you know, our parents take us to a museum, or a friend show us some music that they like, then we have some kind of pressure of, oh, well, this is supposed to be good. I'm supposed to be feeling something here. So let's try to get that feeling. And I think that's a really important way in which our taste develops. So the second kind of example I want to talk about is about failed aesthetic experiences. And I wrote about this a little bit in earlier work, but I think it's an important aspect of aesthetic experiences that they often fail. So very often we go to the museum and we sit down in front of our favorite painting. I mean, and you know, we've had very strong aesthetic experiences in front of that painting before, but just today it's not happening. There's nothing. You don't have any kind of positive experience. You're just, I don't know, looking at it, but nothing's happening. Is this something that resonates? I mean, maybe not with painting, but with music or something. So it's a piece of music that you really like and you play it today, and it's not doing anything for you. So, and on those occasions, we're, I would say that we're really trying hard to not fail in that aesthetic experience, trying hard to actually achieve something there. So that's another kind of salient example in which the kind of action, this kind of intentional effortful action that we perform during aesthetic engagement is it's kind of, it shows up a lot in our lives. Okay. So before we get carried away, I just want to make a kind of clarificatory remark about the scope of the claim. I'm not saying that in all aesthetic experience we have these kind of intentional actions. So I don't want to say that this is a necessary feature of aesthetic experience. It's clearly not. Sometimes we have aesthetic experiences which just kind of really blow us away, and which is nothing we can do about it and nothing we would do about it. So it's not some kind of universal feature of aesthetic experience, but I think it's a really important feature. And so an analogy would be with emotional experiences. So in emotional experience, it's also not the case that all the time we have an emotional experience, we're trying to get that emotional experience. Sometimes emotions really just blow us away, right? You know, if you hear that your grandmother died, you probably don't need to somehow work up your tears, right? So but sometimes, and I think it's an important, in order to understand emotional experiences in general, we need to take this kind of intentional action of trying to get the emotional experience, the emotional regulation into consideration, or you have to take that seriously. And in the same way, when we talk about aesthetic experience, although that's not a necessary feature of aesthetic experience, that we're sometimes trying to get it, we need to understand that in order to have a full picture of what aesthetic experience is. So far, I ran the whole emotional experience and aesthetic experience stuff together. And I think there's a lot of really important and instructive analogies there in terms of how we're really very often, we're trying to have that kind of experience that we know we somehow should have. But I should say that there's also a really important disanalogy. In the case of emotional experiences, we kind of know what it is that we're going for. When I'm at the funeral and I feel that I should be feeling more sad than I am, that I know exactly the kind of experience I want to have. And because I've been sad before, I know exactly that that's the kind of emotional state I want to have. Whereas in the case of aesthetic experience, that's just not the case. We don't really know what it is that we're going for. And that's a really crucial aspect, I think, of the kind of action that's involved in aesthetic experience, that there's an effortful, intentional, goal-directed action, but we don't really know what the goal is. It's a really special kind of action as a result. So let's talk about what kind of action that is. So we've seen that it's an effortful and goal-directed action. What kind of action is it? So we can make this distinction between two different kinds of actions that I'm going to call trophy actions and process actions. And this is just a very general distinction that's not, that can be made not only in the aesthetic domain, it can be made about any kind of action. So there's certain actions that are such that if, and these are the ones that I call trophy actions, that if you don't reach the goal, it's a goal-directed action, but if you don't reach the goal, you've just wasted your time. If you don't get the end result, then it doesn't make sense to do that action at all. So because of this, for these actions, it doesn't make sense to just do them a tiny little bit. You either do them all the way to the goal, or you might as well not do it at all. So one example would be running the marathon, or I don't know, getting tenure at a certain institution. It doesn't make sense to just do a little bit of it, right? Or if you don't get to the end, then then it doesn't make sense to do it. So these are, I'm going to call them trophy activities or trophy actions. And I want to contrast this with process actions, which is just the opposite. So it's actions that you do. Again, these are goal-directed actions, but it's okay not to reach the goal, right? So even if you don't reach the goal, it does make sense to do it. So for these actions, it makes sense to do it just a little bit. You don't have to do all the way to completion. And an example here that I would want to contrast with running the marathon would be walking along the beach. So it's a very general distinction between trophy and process actions. So which one would be the kind of action that's involved in aesthetic engagement? You might think it's process action. I think it's not like that. But before that, so you can have this kind of spiel, and I did this in one of those popular writings that were mentioned in the introduction about somehow how you have to keep a trophy process balance, and that's more important than a work-life balance, because even if work-life balance is kind of silly anyway, and in the life part of work-life balance, you still do a lot of trophy activities. But I don't, this is not, that's not the kind of message I want to give you here. But what I find it's really important here is that the kind of action that's involved in aesthetic experience is neither a trophy nor a process action. It's not a trophy action, because it's very much okay not to reach the goal, right? It makes a lot of sense to do this kind of action, even if just a little bit. And it's not, so in that sense, it's like a process activity. And it's not like, but it's not really like a process activity, in as much as in the case of a process activity, you're not really trying to reach the goal. You're just, you have a goal direction, you do it a little bit, but the goal is not that important. Whereas in the case of the aesthetic action that's involved in the in aesthetic experience, the goal is important, but it's okay not to reach it. So it's somewhere in between. It's some kind of mix and match. So it's you're trying to reach the goal. So it's like a trophy activity like this, but it's okay not to reach the goal. So it's like a process activity. And I think what explains this kind of in between status of these actions is that what's happening in aesthetic engagement is that you're trying to reach the goal. You're trying to have an aesthetic experience, but you don't really know what that aesthetic experience is going to be like. So that's the main kind of distinguishing feature of this action. Now, the title of the talk was aesthetic experiences achievement, and I have kind of mixed feelings about that label, partly because after I came up with this cool title, I actually looked, and there's a lot of philosophy of achievement apparently. So there's a book called Achievement by Gwen Bradford. It's a brilliant ordinary language analysis of the word achievement. And this is where I'm going to rant about ordinary language philosophy, which I think is the most pointless thing you can possibly do in your life. But okay, that's probably enough for a rant. Why? Because mainly ordinary language analysis is about English language. That's not going to be, and I don't know how achievement comes out in other languages than English. I know some languages, for example, in my native language, which is Hungarian, achievement would come out as teljesítmény, which frankly has very different connotation from the word achievement. So I'm not sure how, and also I'm just, what would be the odds that the word that we use for a phenomenon is going to like fully elucidate what the phenomenon is. So, all right, rant over. But what I want to take away from this whole analysis of achievement, which is, again, this is an extremely sensitive and nice analysis that was given by Gwen Bradford. But she thinks that there are two necessary conditions on achievement, and I want to question both of them. One of them is that it's difficult. So something is not an achievement unless it's difficult. And the other one is that in order for something to count as an achievement, there's some competence is required, some kind of, it needs to be a competent achieving of a goal. So pure luck is ruled out. So and I want to, instead of kind of giving you counterexamples, I just want to give you quotes by great musicians, Frédéric Chopin and Rita Ora, just to show you that I'm not an elitist snob. So yeah, you can read the quotes, and I don't particularly want to engage with the whole kind of let's give a necessary and sufficient condition for a meaning of a word that clearly does not have necessary and sufficient conditions. But what I want to take away from this is that I think that while I don't think that these are going to be strict necessary conditions, that an achievement should be difficult and that some competence is required, I want to say that some achievement is not difficult at all, and some achievements, the competence is very dubious. But what is clear, the sense in which I want to use the term achievement is this kind of very minimal sense in which achievement, what is for sure true about achievement is that it takes effort. Achievement is something that is effortful. If it doesn't take effort, then it's not really going to be much of an achievement. And it also needs some kind of idea of what it is that we're doing. Well, that's all. that I'm going to assume about the term achievement. Just good. And I want to kind of distinguish my view about aesthetic experience as achievement between two seemingly close view, and one of them is by Nelson Goodman. So he writes this in the language of art that you might think is, wow, this sounds very much like what I'm saying. That's what I thought, and I got very excited. So he says the aesthetic attitude is restless, searching, testing, is less an attitude than an action, creation and recreation. So that sounds very similar to what I'm trying to do. So you know, I got hopeful, but unfortunately, that does not seem like that's what he has in mind is really what I have in mind. Because in 15 years later, when he's elaborating on this idea, he says that coming to understand a painting or a symphony in an unfamiliar style, to recognize the work of an artist or school, to see or hear in new ways, is as cognitive an achievement as learning to read or write or add. So the reason why I mentioned Goodman is not just to show you that, you know, that here's a view in the vicinity, but also I think it's an important contrast, because Goodman wants to think of this kind of achievement or the kind of action that's involved in aesthetic engagement as a cognitive action. It's something intellectual, something that is done in the kind of higher cognitive parts of your mind, and that's really not what I'm trying to say. I think the kind of achievement, I mean, that can be the case, that can be involved, but that's really not, in typical cases, that's not the kind of achievement that I have in mind. That's not the kind of action that you're doing while you're engaging with an artwork. Very often, it's very simple actions, kind of perceptual actions, attending to this, attending to that. So yeah. The other product differentiation I want to give is with the idea that is very old idea going back to Ovid, who says there is no worth in that which is not a difficult achievement. But this is also just including in this book on achievement that I mentioned before, there's a general kind of pro tanto relation between, you know, the more difficult an achievement is, the more we value it. And I just don't, again, I don't think that that's the case. And I don't think that somehow an aesthetic experience is better because the action involved is more difficult. So it's not the case that, you know, Stockhausen, you know, enjoying a Stockhausen piece is by definition going to be more of an aesthetic experience than enjoying I don't know, what would be a simple piece of work, of musical work. Whatever, pick your I don't know, Haydn, I guess. Then enjoying a Haydn quartet, which actually is pretty difficult. So whatever, pick your not so difficult thing. So it's not about difficulty. It's not about just how difficult your the level of difficulty in achieving that. So that's, again, I just wanted to make it clear that that's not what I'm saying. So I'm not saying like Nelson Goodman is saying that it's a cognitive achievement, and I'm not saying that it's all about the difficulty. And this is this could also count as a product differentiation, although I think it's I think of this as more looking ahead and trying to characterize the kind of action that I'm interested in here in a more precise work. So there's been an influential book by T about the games, which has a lot of really interesting and important implications for aesthetics. So the distinction here is between achievement play, and it's not a very helpful label for my purposes, but let's go with it for now. These are his terms. Achievement play versus striving play. So the idea is that when you play a game, there's two ways you can play a game. The achievement play is when you fix the end and you choose the most efficient means to get to the end. And the striving play is kind of the opposite of that. You don't fix the end, you choose the end on the basis of what kind of means you're enjoying. And basically the end is going to only serve as an excuse to justify the means. So the achievement play is when the means is justified by the end, and the striving play is when the end is justified by the means in some sense. So you might think, and that's exactly what T is thinking, that aesthetic engagement is a prime example of striving play, but I don't think so. I think it's a third way of this kind of means ends relation, So it's not the case that in aesthetic engagements, we choose the end on the basis of what kind of means we're enjoying the most. What happens in aesthetic engagement is some kind of flipping back and forth between these two things. So you fix the end in this case, what kind of aesthetic experience you think you're going to get out of this. And then you choose the means to get there. And then depending on what kind of means you're using there, you adjust the end. And on the basis of that, you adjust the means, and then you adjust the end again, you adjust the means again, and so on. So there's this kind of interesting back and forth there. So it's not really it's not striving play at all. It's some kind of switching back and forth between achievement play and striving play. And that really kind of emphasizes, and this is where I really wanted to get out of this example or this comparison, that the really important feature of this action is that it's an action, but it's an interaction with the object. So this general structure of the relation between the means and the ends, namely that it's not the case that you fix the end for good and then you're just going to go with the most efficient means, or fix the means for good because that's what you're enjoying, and then you find an end that will justify the mean. What's happening is some kind of continuous adjusting of one to the other and then the other to the one. That makes this an interaction, not an action per se, but an interaction with the object, with the aesthetic object that you're engaging with. And it is very much like a lot of activities that we care about a lot. It's very much like a conversation with someone where the same thing seems to be happening, right? There's a kind of a back and forth. There's a kind of a mutual, the two things are sensitive to each other. The means and the ends are sensitive to each other. Same thing is going with friendship, and to use an example that's been used a lot as a comparison for aesthetic experience recently, love. And that's going to get to another recently influential way in which people think about the aesthetic domain recently, namely that somehow one important aspect of aesthetics is that it's really crucially important for the self, for our sense of self. And then there's been the diverging views about why that is, or how to explain that. And here I need to somehow make another clarificatory remark. I've been emphasizing the importance of the activity, of things that we do, things that we have control over with aesthetic experience, right? So if it is the case that while we're aesthetically engaging with something, we're actively trying to do something, that really emphasizes the control over this kind of experience. But I should make it clear that we do not have full control. It's not fully up to us. And remember that example that I started out with about failed aesthetic experiences, where we're really trying to have an aesthetic experience, but it's not happening. So because of this, I think it's fair to describe the aesthetic engagement is not just an interaction, it's a two-way interaction between the object and you and the subject. And that is what makes this action very, very special. So most of the kind of action that's involved in this experience is very, very special. In most experiences, we don't get this kind of two-way interaction. So remember the experience, the contrast case I started out with, the experience of red. When you see a red color, there is no back and forth. There's no two-way interaction between the object and you. The same with toothache as well. These are kind of one-way experiences. But I think one thing that's really important and underrated about aesthetic experiences is it's this kind of two-way interaction between the object and you. And again, just to throw in yet another analogy here, it's a little bit like dancing with someone. So when you're dancing with someone, it's not the case that so you would have to be sensitive to what your dance partner is doing. And then depending on what your dance partner is doing, you adjust your move. And then on the basis of how you adjust your mood, your dance partner is going to do something else, and so on and so on. So you have an action and that gets a reaction, and an action, reaction, action, reaction. So that's the general structure of this action, or rather interaction that's involved here. And that I think that really crucial and central feature of this action of what I call achievement, of the action that's involved in aesthetic experience, that explains many of the things that I talked about earlier. I'm not gonna go back now. Good. Now I should say that on the basis of what I remember from Heidegger, I find it possible that that's what he might have talked about with the earth and all that stuff and fungal loops, but who am I to tell? Okay, so I want to talk about two important consequences of this view. I guess the self was one consequence, but two more important consequences for this view. One of them is for the social aspect of aesthetics, and that's again kind of an important and influential line of argument these days in contemporary aesthetics. People tend to emphasize the social dimension of aesthetics more. By the way, I should ask, how long do I have to give this talk? Do I have 45 minutes, an hour, or what's the? You're muted.
Yeah, 1 hour.
Okay.
1 hour you have.
Okay, cool. Well, I'll be done a little earlier if it's more questions, which is always that. So right, so people have been emphasizing the social aspect of aesthetics, and but in analytic aesthetics, the most influential way in which the social dimension of aesthetics made its appearance is in terms of explaining aesthetic agreements and disagreements. And I want to emphasize, and I did so in earlier work as well, that although that's of course an important aspect in which we share, to figure out what we're agreeing and disagreeing about in the aesthetic domain, that can be an important thing in our social interactions with others. It can make us feel closer to someone or less close. What we really care about is not really the aesthetic agreement and disagreement, but rather having aesthetic experiences together. Go to a concert together, listen to the music, listen to a musical piece together, watching a film together, and so on, looking at the painting together. Whether we agree on it or not is kind of a very coarse-grained and kind of pale imitation to the kind of closeness experience that having an aesthetic experience together can bring. And I think we can understand why this kind of shared aesthetic experiences or having aesthetic experiences together are so important, or why we find that so crucial in understanding our social interactions with each other. And that's kind of follows from what I said before. If aesthetic experience is achievement, is the kind of action that I talked about so far, this kind of achievement that's an interaction with the object and so on, then shared aesthetic experience is joint achievement. And of course, joint achievement is something that very much brings people together. Just look at the people celebrating the goals after they scored a goal into Euro 2020. So that is the real social glue. So I don't think that aesthetic agreements and disagreements really bring you a very strong kind of social glue. It gives you a pale substitute, I think. We can talk about this, but nothing really depends on this for the purposes of this talk. But what I really care about for the purposes of this talk is that what makes for a really important social glue is the kind of important bond between any two people, is this kind of joint achievement that's brought about by having aesthetic experiences together. Okay, and the last thing, in case you thought that I'm not going to talk about global aesthetics, which is that's my big next project that this is a part of. This talk is going to be a part of. So this is also going to go in the direction of global aesthetics. So here's the thing about this kind of actions that you perform in aesthetic experiences. It's very much learned. You learn the kind of actions that you do in order to get to an aesthetic experience from your peers and from your parents and from your friends. And because of this, this is one of the many things that explains the interpersonal variations in aesthetic experience. There are huge interpersonal variations in aesthetic experience. There's also huge intrapersonal variations. You can have aesthetic experience of the very same object today and none of that tomorrow. But there's also just huge interpersonal variations. Two people looking at the same object, same lighting conditions, could have very different kind of aesthetic experiences, or aesthetic experience or the like thereof, and so on. But part of what explains these interpersonal variations, and I've been talking about this in very different terms in earlier work about how tension, of course, makes a difference in experience, and of course, if you're attending differently, then your experience is going to be different. But what I want to emphasize today is that there are going to be these variations, because there are variations in how it is that you're trying to achieve the aesthetic experience, and also what kind of aesthetic experience you're trying to achieve. So the difference in the action that you're performing during aesthetic engagement is what explains the variation in aesthetic experience. And again, that's because we learn, you and I learned very different ways and very different kind of actions that we're trying to use in order to get the aesthetic experience. And this is where we get, when it gets to the global stuff, there are also cultural differences in aesthetic experience. And there's a nice literature on that. And again, one thing, the question is what explains that? And what I want to emphasize today, I'm going to give you other explanations in a second, but I want to emphasize today is that, again, there are these cultural differences because there are cultural differences in the actions that you use, in what we are trying to do to achieve the aesthetic experience. So just to go back to step back and kind of try to think about the globalness of aesthetics. One important thing I think that as aestheticians who are mainly, I think, in this room, in this virtual room, are working in the Western tradition, are trying to explain when we're doing aesthetics, is that it's a really important thing that we should not assume, and we cannot assume that just because I have a certain kind of experience of an object, this is the kind of experience that everyone else is going to have. So just because I go to the Louvre and look at the Mona Lisa and have a certain kind of aesthetic experience, I should not be assuming that that's the kind of experience that everyone else is going to have. And the same is true if I'm going to not to the Louvre, but to the Musée de l'Homme, or whatever it's called, the new Musée de l'Homme, and look at an artifact from Oceania, and the kind of experience that I have is not going to be the kind of experience that other people have from other cultural backgrounds, including the cultural background of Oceania. And I think that's just a really important thing that aesthetics should be attending to, and it hasn't really. And the reason for that, some of the reason for that is that that aesthetics, and that's the kind of big accusation. If you talk a lot to art historians, they're going to, and you tell them that you're an esthetician, they're going to accuse you of being a cultural universalist, because that's what they think that aesthetics is doing, is to look for these universals, these aesthetic universals that kind of paper over all these cultural differences. And that is true to some traditions in aesthetics. It's definitely true for, funnily enough, to the kind of more empirical uses of aesthetics and neuroaesthetics. They really just put you in a scanner and show you images and make you rate them regardless of cultural differences. But what, of course, art historians, they are in a completely different game. What they really want to know about is the cultural variations. So, but what I want to say is that it's not, if we are taking the empirical stuff seriously, which I do in my other life as a philosopher of perception, then that should really push us away from cultural universalism and towards cultural variations. And the reason for that is the top-down influences on perception. So this is going to be very brief, so don't worry if that's intimidating. So the way the visual system works is that there's light hits your retina, and then the input goes to the LGN, and then primary visual cortex, secondary visual cortex, V4, and then up to IT. But it's not the full story. There's not just this feed forward kind of bottom up mechanism. There's also top down mechanism. There's a lot of kind of feedback mechanisms that go from higher levels of perceptual processing to lower level of perceptual processing. And that's going to have important implications for all this stuff. So if you look at this picture, you probably don't know what it depicts, unless you've seen me give this talk before. And the researchers worked hard to hide what it depicts, but this is what it depicts, right? And then if you look at it again, if you look at the same picture again, you're going to have a very different experience. It's not only that you're going to have a very different experience, your visual system works very differently after you've seen this. So just to give you the very short account, so you see the line that the girl's nose corresponds to. there's no line here on this black and white picture, on this bitonal picture. And because of this, before you've seen the color picture, the neurons in your prime visual cortex did nothing that were there. But after you've seen it, the direction sensitive neurons that are corresponding to the contour of the nose, they're firing away like crazy. So that's a kind of a nice illustration of how top-down influence of perception works. Now, what I want, and this is something that I've emphasized before. The takeaway from this, I think, is that because of this, because your vision really depends on the kind of things that you've seen before. Because of this, the kind of Wolff-Linian line about the history of vision actually does make some kind of sense. So Wolff-Linian famously said, vision itself has its history, and the revelation of these visual strata is the primary task of art history. And we can make, given that there are kind of these different people in different parts of history, they've seen different visual stimuli, and then as a result, they've seen what they saw differently. But we can make this claim not about history, but about geography of, so we can talk this with the geography of vision. So different people in different parts of the world, they were exposed to very different kind of stimuli. And as a result, when they look at the same thing now, they're gonna have very different experiences because of the top-down influences of perception. I'm gonna skip this. And I want to just talk about two important determinants of why these kind of top-down influences are important in the aesthetic domain. So the general line of argument here is that top-down influences change the way we see an artwork, a visual art. I talk say visual artwork here, but it's also true for other art forms. And there's two kind of determinants of that: attention and mental imagery. So top-down influences change our attention and our mental imagery, and that's what's going to change our experience. And as a result of this, we can expect cross-cultural variations in attention, in mental imagery, and that's what's going to explain why our experience of artworks is going to be, or our aesthetic experience in general, would be different in different cultural backgrounds. I'm just going to say something very simple about attention and mental imagery before I get back to the whole action stuff that I started out with. So this is an artifact from Oceania, from the Solomon Islands. And when you look at it, you might think it's like a nice abstract pendant, but I can tell you that if you look at the bottom of it, it normally works better if I can actually point at things. I can't really do that here. Can I? Can you see my cursor? You can't see my cursor? Yes. You can't see my cursor?
Yes, yes.
Okay, cool. So this apparently is, so this is the Solomon Island. It's a very tiny island where they make these things. And what they depend on is fishing. And the way they can tell whether they're fish or not is this kind of bird that flies over the fish. And that's how they know where to get fish. And that bird is depicted, that is that bird. And these are fish, called dolphin-like looking things. So this little hump, so after I told you this, you can have the same kind of things that I had here, just before, after, as a result of top-down information. Before I told you all this, these little humps probably did not make that much of a difference in your perceptual experience. After I told you that these are the humps of dolphins, they might have made a more important distinction. So you're going to attend to different features given the kind of background information you have as a result of top-down influences. And given that attention has famously a very important influence on experience, that's part of what explains the difference in experience. So I talked about how what you're attending to makes a difference, but also the way you're attending to also makes a difference. So this is a kind of famous eye tracking study about experts and non-experts, art experts and art novices, about where they're looking when they're looking at a picture. So the column in the middle is the way novices look. So they basically just kind of focus their attention on the main features, like the figure here, on the face here. Whereas people with some kind of art historical training, they have a more distributed thing going on. And that also makes a big difference for the experience. Not just what you're attending to, but also the way you're attending to it. Next one is mental imagery. So mental imagery also has an important role to play in our engagement with with art, and I'm going to focus on visual art because it's easier to show. And again, as imagery also depends on top-down influences, our experience is also going to depend on top-down influences. And given that the top-down influences are different in different cultures, that's gonna be a mediator of these cross-cultural differences. So this is the first shot of the Buster Keaton film Cops. So you go to the cinema, you buy a ticket to film that is called Cops, and then this is the first image that you see. So you're probably gonna think, well, Buster is behind bars. He's in the prison. Well, he's not. He's just behind a gate. And the reason why he has this kind of sad face is because that's just the face he has, I guess. And also his girlfriend just broke up with him. So again, there's your expectations, this top-down influences, they're very much influencing the general experience that you have. And that's going to be very culturally sensitive if you don't know that in the 20s, early 1920s, you know, that's the kind of bars that you had in prisons, then it's not going to really work for you, this joke. And this is a work of a contemporary Indonesian artist, very much relies on the mental imagery that you have of horses here. But the important kind of culturally sensitive issue here is that in Indonesian cultures, horses are very much connected to oppression, because basically the horses were only used by military. You probably don't have that connotation, so you're going to have a very different kind of experience, very different kind of mental imagery here. And as a result, you can have a very different kind of experience here. So that's, again, kind of one way in which you can explain why there are cultural differences in aesthetic experience as a result of the cultural background mediated by attention and mental imagery. And so because of all this, because there are all these cross-cultural variations in attention and mental imagery, there are going to be cross-cultural variations in our engagement. So universalism is a non-option. But just to kind of bring all of the stuff about achievement that we talked about together, talked about earlier today, because there's a third reason, or I don't know, like an extra reason, a really important reason for these cross-cultural variations in aesthetic engagement, namely the cross-cultural variations of what we do, of how we are trying to achieve the kind of experience and what it is that we're trying to achieve. So because of this, aesthetic universalism is even less of an option. So really global aesthetics is the only way to go. And yeah, thank you very much.